Okay. So hello, everyone, and welcome to this Sustainable Consumption Brown Bag Lunch. I'm very happy today to welcome Henrike Rau, who is joining us from LMU in Munich, and she will be giving a talk on mobility practices across the life course. So Henrike is Professor of Social Geography and Sustainability Research in the Department of Geography at LMU in Germany. She's made very interesting and important contributions to conceptual and methodological advancements in terms of social scientific inquiry into mobility research, especially regarding a critical application of the new mobilities paradigm and an investigation into mobility practices across the life course, which we will hear more about today. She's currently leading mixed methods research on projects including non-cyclists, Red Active, which I think we might be hearing about today as well, and cycling safety. So her latest edited book should be coming out in December with Edward Elgar, called Mobility and Travel Behavior Across the Life Course, Qualitative and Quantitative Approaches. So Henrike, we're really happy to have you with us here today. We very much look forward to your talk. You have about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll open the floor to questions. I see many of our students have arrived, and we really look forward to hearing you. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you very much, Marlene, for the very kind introduction. And I'm very pleased to be here today. I had plans, of course, to travel to Geneva. Unfortunately, this was not possible. So we're right in the middle of another big sort of mobility crisis. So the talk today is very befitting in many ways. So I hope you'll find the talk interesting, and you'll find some topics and points that inspire your own work as well. I'm going to share my screen with you now for the next 45 minutes or so, and then hopefully we'll have a lively discussion afterwards where I'll be able to maybe drill down into certain issues in a bit more depth, etc. And please, if I go too fast, let me know. Just raise your hand or make yourself known. I can slow down a little bit. So I'll share my screen. Hopefully this will work, and we can get started. Okay. So as Marlene already alluded to, I'm going to talk about mobility practices across the life course today, and this is one of the main focal points of my own research. And with the flyer that you were given, you also received an overview of today's talk, and that's something I wanted to start with today. I just have to check, yeah. So here you have a short sort of synopsis of what I'm going to talk about today. And so I'll start with some introductory remarks about the centrality of mobility in modern societies. And I will then switch quite quickly, or move on quite quickly, to think a little bit about and talk about people's biographies in relation to mobility, and how these mobility biographies reflect mobility cultures, mobility practices, and different aspects of mobile life, if you like, in modern societies. Following on from this, I would like to give you an insight into some empirical data that I've collected over the years, and in particular I'm going to introduce you to a project that we're currently finishing up at LMU, which is called Red Active. Marlene just mentioned it. That looks at non-cyclists, so people who cycle very infrequently or don't cycle at all, and one aspect of that project relates very much to people's mobility biographies and how that shapes their modal choice and their mobility practices more generally. And I'll finish off with some concluding remarks. So just to introduce the topic today, mobility, as many of you know, or all of you know, is a key feature of everyday life in late modern societies. And this has become particularly obvious in the last few months or so during the COVID pandemic, where we have seen very significant restrictions in people's mobility practices. So it's been a phase of immobility for many people. At the same time, we've also seen very dramatic changes in how people move about in everyday life, especially those who are still forced to move, for example, to get to their jobs, etc. So immobility and mobility are central themes of modern life, in particular during the current crisis. But we also know that this has implications not just for society, but also for the natural environment. So obviously the rising greenhouse gas emissions from the transport sector globally are a major area of concern for many people, especially those involved in climate protection action. But there's more to that as well. Of course, what we see in many cities, for example, and Munich is no exception, is an accelerating competition for space and time, especially when you have cities like Munich that are rapidly expanding as well. So different transport modes are competing for space and time. In addition, we've seen an increased vulnerability of transport systems. And again, Corona is a very good example of that. We've seen in Germany, and I'm sure it's the same in other parts of Europe, an increasing vulnerability of the public transport system, in that there's a very significant drop in the number of passengers and trips taken. And obviously, a lot of these systems depend on ticket sales. So we've seen the exposure of public transport to these types of crises. So there's an urgent need for a sustainability transition in relation to mobility, but there's also a lack of progress. And I wanted to give you some reasons or why this lack of progress can be observed. So apart from an over-reliance on a lot of technological innovation, and I hope that new engine technologies will help us address this. We can also see that there's often a very strong emphasis on individuals to make the right choices, and that within a system that's essentially geared towards unsustainable mobility. You know, in the context of Germany, you have a very car-centered system, for example. So individuals have been tasked with the job of making the right choices, which you find very difficult in the current system. And of course, even if we can detect some areas of improvement in places like Germany, we can see a rebound effect in many other places and on a global scale. So we have a number of very tricky issues or wicked problems, as some people would phrase it. But what is also perhaps very important, and this is a focal point of my talk today, is the idea that we have transport policy in many places that has this one-size-fits-all approach, and that ignores, for example, shifts in travel demand and shifts in mobility practices across the life course. So, you know, you can use your own examples here, perhaps, but I've brought one with me. We're currently working with a local group in Munich to help them think a little bit more about what a child-friendly local area might look like. So children's mobility, for example, is often very constrained by car-centric transport and land use policies in urban areas. And these obviously cater for adult drivers. So we have different groups in the population that, because of where they find themselves in the life course, are severely disadvantaged because of our focus on other groups and their travel needs, etc. The same can be said for elderly people, people with visual impairments, etc. So this is a major issue that we have to think about as well when we talk about this lack of progress. What's perhaps also very important is we need to ask ourselves, as social scientists interested in mobility, what is mobility for? And what you see there is often a very poor understanding of the social and cultural reasons why people move and are mobile, and the resulting consumption of distance. So we have to really start understanding better why people engage in different mobility practices. So we've already received very important clues and input from all those who have been engaged in this new mobilities paradigm work. Obviously, John Urry was a major name in this particular group, but there's also many other colleagues in the UK, for example, who have engaged in this new mobilities paradigm work. So the idea that society needs to be understood as a set of mobilities, and that mobility is central to everyday life, and that our theoretical tools to describe society, explain society, need to revolve around mobility. What is interesting as a complementary strand, and this is the focus of today's talk, is that there's also people who have thought about how mobility changes across time. So we have this mobility biographies approach that has gained traction and has become a very interesting research arena. And so I have had the privilege of working with a lot of the people that are listed here: Martin Lanzendorf at Frankfurt University, Joachim Scheiner, for example, who's based at the TU Dortmund, people who have established the field of my mobility biographies research in a major way. And over the last 5 to 7 years or so, I've also contributed to this particular research field. And it's a very interesting and dynamic area that I would like to introduce you to today. So mobility across the life course is a major focal point of this new research field. And what we see here is an alternative conceptualization of mobility as consumption of distance that changes across the life course. So this is a sort of a working definition, if you like, that could be used here. So this opens up a new perspective on the dynamics of mobility practices. So there's an inherent focus on changing mobility practices over time, as opposed to looking at sort of cross sections at certain points in time. So the focus on dynamics is very unique here. And it also links individuals' life trajectory to societal transformations. I find this a very interesting and important aspect. And maybe the third point for some of you who might be familiar with different ideas around the individualization of the life course, which you know, have emerged in sociology of the family, sociology of the life course in the last 20 years or so. You know, here we have an opportunity to critically examine these ideas that, you know, life courses have become individualized projects as opposed to things that are shared across larger groups in society. When you adopt a focus on mobility biographies, this individualization of the life course thesis becomes less tenable. Because you can see that there's still large groups that do things at roughly the same time in their life courses, and so that's an interesting angle as well. I don't want to dwell too much on it, but just for those of you maybe who would like to read further on the subject, there are some interesting angles to discover. So what is the mobility biographies research field all about? Past achievements, methodologies, and future trends. I'd like to give you some overview here. For those of you who are familiar with the field already, you will probably see some well-known names, and you may have come across some of the publications and studies I'm going to introduce. And for those of you who are new to this topic, I hope you'll find some interesting points too. From a point of view of terminology, we can think about mobility biographies as a series of stages that capture both continuity and change. This is an important point. When you look at mobility biographies, you can see phases of seemingly sort of great continuity, if you like, and then there's phases as well where you see rapid changes in how people, for example, move about in everyday life. And to be able to understand these dynamic processes is a core task of this field of research. And what can help you here as well is to focus on potential events or disruptions in this sort of, you know, continuity track, if you like. And in the literature, you find two major categories. One is the category of so-called life events. So you can think about people changing location, so relocation issues, or when you have a new child in your household, and these are important life events that reflect social, political, and economic constructions of the life course, and they often bring about or coincide with changes in mobility. The second category of major events is what we, my colleague Richard Manton and I called mobility milestones. These also mirror wider mobility systems on the infrastructure people find themselves exposed to, and so on. And you can think of getting a driving license here as a major milestone in many people's lives. And this continues to be the case, despite the fact that many younger people in urban areas either delay getting a license or don't get one at all. But we can still see that there's, the majority of people in Germany and other European countries do get a license at some stage in their lives, in some cases just that bit later than what used to be the norm, which was, you barely finished school and you had the driving license. Okay, buying a car can also be a major milestone, but I haven't added this to the slide here, but you can also think about mobility related milestones that are perhaps less positive. Accidents, this has been shown in our own research, accidents can also act as a major milestone where people reconsider their mobility practices. Because they respond to, for example, a bicycle accident or a car crash, etc. So these are important milestones too. So you can just conceptually, you can think a little bit sort of an onion model, if you like, or a nested model where, you have this orange circle where you have wider social, economic and infrastructural conditions. You have issues concerning governance and policy, and embedded in that is, a whole complex set of social and cultural norms that relate to the life course and also relate to mobility, and these become intertwined. There's also specific policies that influence the life course and also mobility. So when you think about support that is given by, say, the German government, for example, for younger families to acquire a property, that obviously has implications for their life course, but also has implications for mobility across the entire life course. So once you decide you want to buy a house in the countryside outside of Munich, and you commit yourself to commuting in and out of Munich to get to work, you have a whole set of life course and mobility issues in front of you that you have to deal with. And obviously that isn't just an individual choice. This is something that happens collectively across different parts of the population. And obviously the availability of particular mobility tools and infrastructure is also very important here. So, a classic example that's happened to us a lot during the pandemic so far is people who have relocated to more rural areas of Bavaria because they moved back into their parents' house. Students of ours have reported that, they don't have many of the options, mobility options, infrastructure options that their friends and colleagues in more densely populated urban areas have. And it's not just mobility, it's also issues to do with access to the internet, etc. So, we must not forget there's different sort of preconditions that people face. And then nested within that, you have the individual mobility biography that reflects, these norms, related policies, and mobility tools and infrastructure. And that sort of manifests itself within the individual mobility biography. So it makes sense to look at those as well. Importantly as well, I mentioned life events and also mobility milestones earlier as two major focal points of mobility biographies research. It's very important here to see them as interconnected, and this is not just a sort of trivial matter. You might say, well, of course, if I change where I live and or I change where I work, it's very likely that I will have to change aspects of my mobility habits as well. But in some cases, these connections can be quite complicated. So, you can think about a circular kind of connection here as well. I mentioned accidents earlier, so that can have an impact on other life events as well. So it's not just a sort of one directional connection. I move house, I change the way I move. In daily life, there can be sort of loops and other directions here as well. So just to alert you to that, and especially those of you who might might have an interest in investigating these things quantitatively, this is of course very important when you try and disaggregate the impact of these different events on people's mobility biographies. As part of the last few years, we've always tried to detect, I suppose, trends in the literature around mobility biographies. And here is a table I wanted to show you. It's a few years old now, but just to give you an idea as well of what the types of themes and topics can be found in the mobility biographies literature. And when you look at the first column there, you can see some very familiar names in the mobility biographies research field: Kiran Chatterjee, Martin Lansendorf, Joachim Scheiner, etc., etc. So for those of you who might want to read on after this talk, you have a good sort of overview here in terms of names that have covered mobility biographies in great detail. And what you can see here is that there are some events, life events, and also some mobility milestones that have received a lot of attention. And then there's obviously some important research gaps here as well. This is actually just for those of you who are working on your own projects. This is quite a neat way of looking at research gaps as well when you do a literature review like you have it here in front of you. So you can see that car ownership and car availability, for example, is a well-covered mobility milestone. On the other hand, traffic accidents are not. So there's some interesting gaps there as well. Cycling environment is another gap that you can see from the table, and that's interesting. There's a lot of research being conducted right now partly because of COVID-19 on temporary cycling infrastructure, cycling environments in urban areas, etc. So just to give you a flavor of what's being covered. And then alternatively, you can also look at the green part of the overview here, and you see some key life events that are covered: residential relocation and also childbirth are well covered areas, whereas, for example, illness, injury, and health changes are not that well understood just yet in that body of work. And I've summarized this. So life events and mobility milestones, there are some prominent ones and less prominent ones. Maybe the third point here could be of interest as well. It's important to also start thinking about how mobility practices are part of systems of interlocking practices. So it's not just mobility practices that we need to focus on. I think we also need to start thinking more about what mobility is for. And so caring for others, children, elderly relatives, for example, is often intertwined with mobility practices. And so I chose this image here of three small school bags sort of parked in front of a car to demonstrate the sort of connectivity between caring for children and mobility. So driving children to school is obviously a very important aspect of this debate. Apart from the conceptual, theoretical, and also empirical work that has been done, I find the mobility biographies research field very interesting from a methodological point of view as well. And Marlene already alluded to an upcoming edited collection that Joachim Scheiner and I have edited, and that will be published later in the year with Edward Elgar. And that particular edited collection looks at research methodologies that have been used across the MBR field. And what we were able to show with that particular collection is that there's still a very strong dominance of quantitative studies in this field. That's obviously not a problem per se, but it becomes problematic when that's the only research approach. And so what we've seen is a very important expansion of the range of methods in the quantitative field to try and capture mobility biographies over longer periods of time as well. I'll show you some examples in a minute. Live calendars, event diaries, etc. feature very strongly here. In contrast, have limited numbers of qualitative or mixed methods approaches. This is something that we're addressing in the book. And so I've had an interest in developing qualitative mobility biographies research in more depth. And I've been able to engage in projects to that effect. So there's some publications here that you could look at if you wish to do so. But in general, this is a minority of studies compared to quantitative research in this field. So just to give you an idea what this looks like, you have a whole range of established tools that can be used to quantify mobility biographies. So you have examples here from Lansendorf 2003, Chatterjee 2013, Bike and Axhausen 2012, and Ajay and Behrens 2013. So these are different calendars, live calendars, where you can basically see people entering different aspects of their mobility biography, where they lived, what modes of transport they could avail of, whether or not they moved to other places, did they have any significant other people in their lives that maybe lived somewhere else. Here you have a reference to a girlfriend in Hungary, for example. And so this is a way of kind of visualizing, if you like, the people's mobility trajectory across the life course, and a sort of an attempt to link it to important events as well, like relocation, first child, second child, third child, etc. So there is a number of interesting examples. It doesn't always have to be that sort of preset. You can also get sort of more manually entered data, like you have here in front of you now, where people are able to basically pencil in their own biographies in different categories. And so there's a few other examples like that in the literature. So again, if you fancy looking, or if you would like to look at that in more detail, here's some references for you. In the past, I've also been able to use these types of tools in a project together with my colleague Richard Manton. We conducted some work using a live calendar approach, and also we tried to capture changes in people's modal choice around a life event. So I give you an example here of what our survey looked like. So we had a baseline part where people were able to enter their main mode of travel to primary school, which is obviously an interesting starting point for many discussions around mobility biographies. And then also the main mode of travel to secondary school, and then current travel modes. So you had a baseline that you could use, and then we were able to basically have a grid that popped up for people to enter their main modes at certain stages in their lives. So they entered their age on the first page, and then they got this grid basically that was tailored to their actual biological age. So you can see you have somebody here who's aged 42, and then they were able to enter information into this so-called life course calendar. And also then we had a third section where we had an effort to capture event effects. So what you had here was a drop-down menu. You can see it here on the left-hand side, a life event. There was a whole range of life events that you could choose from based on our literature review. And then people were able to enter how that impacted on their travel mode. So maybe cycling went up, and walking went up, and public transport stayed the same, and driving went down, and being in the car as a passenger went down. So just to give you an example. So there's a lot of work behind this. This looks quite neat, and it was very useful for our study. And but at the same time, this was a fairly complicated process to set this up. So this is not something one would do in a student project. There's a lot of person months involved in setting up something like this. But from our perspective, Richard and I found this a very useful tool. And yeah, if you want to find out more about this, the reference is included in my slides. The mode of analysis for these types of data is very, very interesting, because you have to find a way to connect these different events and to look at shifts in how people travel. So this is something to consider as well. So here's an example of a sort of preliminary analysis for one person, where we try to sketch their mobility biography. So it's one way of doing it, but also obviously if you want to aggregate this, you have to lose some of the detail that you have here in front of you. And this was one of the major tasks we had to face. Okay. In the last part of my talk today, I want to give you some concrete empirical examples, just to give you an insight into how mobility biographies research can be used, also with a view to bringing about perhaps a sort of desired sustainability transition in the transport system. And so I want to give you a short example, first of all, of a qualitative study that my colleague Mary Green and I conducted some years ago. And here you can see, again, an effort to just try and capture details of people's mobility biographies in a more qualitative way. This was done in Ireland, so some of the references you see here in the table are actually, they relate to Irish places, so just in case you're wondering. So this was something that Mary did for her PhD research, and Richard Mant and I were doing parallel work at the same time. So it's a strong focus on Ireland. But I think you can see from this slide here, you know, the sort of what's possible, I suppose, in a qualitative sense, to try and record people's mobility biographies. And also mobility milestones. So we were able to extract all of this from qualitative interviews that we conducted with different people at different stages in their lives. So we had an older woman here giving us a lot of information, details about her mobility biographies. What is also interesting is when you try, and this is obviously a work in progress still, when you try and link this to wider changes in social conditions or context and policy context. So what we had in the context of Ireland, for example, was a very significant economic boom followed by a major bust. And this is sort of the period, say, between the late 1990s to 2007, 2008. And so what you can see in some cases, people refer to this explicitly in their interviews, it's a connection between the wider context, you know, the policy environment, etc., and their own mobility biographies. But oftentimes people are not that aware of these connections. So it helps when researchers try and link these two. It's a very complicated exercise, but it does help you understand shifts in people's mobility biography that might be related to major policy changes. And of course, we're already looking at the impact of COVID on people's mobility biographies. And this is obviously a major life event that affects many millions of people around the world. So it'd be very interesting to see how that impacts on people's mobility biographies. But yeah, we have to wait, I suppose, how these things pan out in the future. A second project that I wanted to bring with me today is the Radactief project. And this is a project funded by the Federal Ministry of Transport and Digital Infrastructure in Germany. And I'm working on this with two colleagues at LMU, my colleague Johannes Mahne-Bieder and my colleague Monika Popp. And the title of the project is Radactief, and it focuses on the so activation potential, if you like, in inverted commas, of people who currently don't cycle. So our focus is on non-cyclists. So we're very interested in people who do not cycle, because they actually make up a very large part of the population. And the German government has an explicit goal to increase the share of people cycling in everyday life. And so we basically argue that it's very important to understand, first of all, why people don't cycle, and to understand that group of non-cyclists, including possible life events and mobility milestones in the past that have impacted on their cycling practices. So here's a quick overview of this project for you, maybe just to look at. it's still a work in progress, but we're nearing completion now, and we're working on some policy recommendations right now. But what I wanted to show you today is just some insights into this very large group of non-cyclists, especially focusing on life events and mobility milestones. So this is something that I find very important. If you want to find out more about it, there's a link to an entry on ResearchGate, but you can also just Google it if you like. The Radioactive project design comes in 3 parts. You have an initial module where we did some expert interviews and interviews with non-cyclists. Then there was a national representative survey in Germany, and I'm going to focus mostly on that today. And now there is obviously the screening of existing measures to promote cycling. We have to obviously change that a little bit now, given the pandemic. There's some interesting new angles to explore, and workshops. We just managed to have one workshop before the lockdown in spring, and so we've conducted some online interviews, and we're currently developing some guidelines for policymakers. So just to talk a little bit about the survey. This was a representative online survey. We got some help with that because we wanted a large representative sample, and so we ended up with 5,002 cases. And we then applied a cluster analysis to develop a typology of non-cyclists, and also to identify specific barriers that prevent people who don't cycle from cycling. So this is obviously underpinned by our own theoretical and conceptual work. And one major point, we argued from the beginning that a lot of pro-cycling measures are geared towards people who already cycle. So they're less suitable for activating non-cyclists. And secondly, a lot of these measures are quite blind to people's needs at different stages in their lives. So a lot of cycling infrastructure is not very child-friendly. A lot of cycling infrastructure that we have at the moment is not very family friendly when you talk about, for example, carrier bikes, larger cargo bikes that can be used to transport children, and so on. So this was sort of the background to all of this. So just to give you some ideas, and I must admit I don't know enough about the Swiss system to draw any comparisons, but perhaps some of you can help me with this during the discussion. In terms of bicycle ownership and use in Germany, you can see there is a sizable proportion of households that don't have a bicycle. And when you look at the share of non-cyclists, people who cycle less than once a month, you can see there's almost half of it. Well, in the mobility in Germany survey in 2017, it was exactly half of the people. So this is a very, very large part of the population. The Department of Transport thinks that a cycling modal share of 15% of all trips is possible. So we're currently hovering around the 11-12%, so we're still far short. And this was part of their National Cycling Plan 2020, and we're eagerly awaiting new goals now past 2020 around cycling. And so when you look at cycling, the modal share for trips and the modal share for person kilometers, you can see that this is still, there's a lot of room for improvement, if you like. In terms of research done today, we have a lot of existing typologies of cyclists, but we understand very little in terms of, we now have limited knowledge of the views, habits, and social circumstance of non-cyclists and how they became non-cyclists. So this is obviously something where this life course perspective and this mobility biographies perspective comes in very handy to try and think about how people became non-cyclists. And so we've adapted this mobility biographies approach here in the context of Radioactive to get away from these cross-sectional analyses and to think about a more longitudinal trajectory towards non-cycling. Our sample for the survey is very interesting to look at as well. So as I said, we have a large chunk of people who don't even have a bicycle. This is an important point. One minor flaw here is that we don't know exactly how many people in our sample use shared bicycle options, but this is I reckon this is a very small part. And then you have about 3/4 of people who have at least one bicycle in the household. E-bike ownership is on the rise, probably the same in Switzerland, but we can see that this is still in the single-digit area, at least for now. But obviously, this is a rapidly expanding market. But again, you see that it's mostly cyclists who use e-bikes, so you get very few people who haven't cycled before who suddenly decide to buy themselves an e-bike. And as I said, when you look at the frequency of use, people who use the bicycle on a daily basis, 1 to 3 times a week, and more than that. And then obviously our interesting group here is less than once a month or nearly never. So you can see once again, this is a 50% share. Interestingly, the gender division is fairly clear-cut. I was quite surprised by that. I thought there would be more women not cycling, but that's not true. Based on the Central Statistics Office in Germany, but also on Radaktiv, it's quite equally split. So that's an interesting finding in itself, and we've discovered later on as well that we have a lot of cycling, pro-cycling activists as well in Munich, for example, female and in their 60s, and so you can see it's quite well spread across the life course as well. Cycling and non-cycling is a migratory background, so the idea that people have parents who come from outside of Germany or who may have moved to Germany at a later stage in their lives and not born in Germany, and there's again an interesting segment here when you look at the right hand side of the graph. There's very little research on, for example, young people whose parents might have moved to Germany recently and their mobility practices. So there's a big research gap there that needs to be filled. And some results now for you to peruse, I suppose, just to give you an idea. When you look at cyclists and non-cyclists, there's an, broadly a sort of an equal distribution. Well, we weren't that surprised by these gender differences. There's some differences around residential area, but again, nothing too surprising here. You would almost expect that. Actually, I was quite surprised that the share of cyclists and non-cyclists was about the same for the village level. I thought there'd be a bigger division there, so it's important to bear that in mind. This is again, there's a lot of sort of common ideas out there around how cycling is distributed across the population, Germany and elsewhere. So it's quite good to check the facts sometimes. And then you can see, obviously, a comparison of cyclists and non-cyclists for stage of life. I want to stop here for a moment to give you a chance to look at this in a bit more detail. So obviously, you can see that the chunk of non-cyclists is quite large for our so-called third agers. This is obviously important here to mention that this is a cohort effect potentially, as well as an age effect, in the sense that there's people who may not have cycled all their lives, and they obviously continue to not cycle and when they're 75 and older. But obviously, there's also the element of older people giving up cycling because of perceived frailty or actual frailty. Interestingly, the e-bike market is very vibrant in the category old age pensioners. There's a lot of activity there. So people who might feel that they can no longer cycle manually might then switch to an e-bike. So this is an interesting segment. And obviously you can see at the lower end there, vocational training, college, university. So most of the people who are listening to this talk today would fall into that category. You have a bigger chunk of people who cycle. So these are some of the results that we could work with. This is starting to get quite interesting. You look at bicycle ownership. I mentioned it already, but there is obviously a lot of discussion to be had around how availability of maybe bike sharing schemes might be relevant in terms of encouraging people to cycle and to take up cycling more regularly. I mean, this is something that needs to be understood in the context of people's residential situation as well. You know, there's a lot of places still where it's almost impossible to store a bicycle in a safe way. So this will also have an impact on bicycle ownership, and you can see that across different countries in Europe. That, you know, small urban apartments where you have no basement and no bicycle parking facilities pose an actual challenge to people who may wish to take up cycling. That's not really the most important. What we were most intrigued by is actually the reasons people give for not cycling. And what you have here is a slide that shows you people's opinions concerning the suitability of cycling as a practical mobility tool for everyday life. And this is really where the mobility biographies approach comes in handy, because you can start thinking about how people get these ideas. You know, is a bicycle a useful tool to get from A to B, or is it something that people find too difficult to use, too awkward? You know, it's raining, I don't want to go outside and cycle. So you can see there's huge differences here between the cyclists and the non-cyclists in our sample, and especially the trip to work for many is something where they don't see a role for cycling at all. Yeah, so there's a very strong emphasis on leisure trips in both categories, but especially around the work trips, you can see a major differences. Okay, so again, you could ask yourself, you know, is that something that people have first-hand experience of? You know, did they maybe live too far away from their place of work, or did they have a bad experience in the past in terms of cycling to work? So there's a whole range of issues there. What's also interesting is, and again, this is right into people's mobility biographies, is their exposure to cycling as part of their social environment. And what we can see here is that on the non-cyclist side, you have very few people whose social environment actually motivates them to cycle, and where the family is actually engaged in cycling. So overall, from our research in Radioactive, we could see that a lot of people who are non-cyclists have grown up in an environment that is basically very far removed from cycling as a daily practice. They have no first-hand experience of what it's like to get around in everyday life using a bicycle, and they don't see it as a very useful mobility tool. Okay, and this is obviously something that we can think about in terms of mobility socialization, in terms of education in schools. There's very little emphasis on cycling, even though this could be an interesting activity that can be done in schools. So you can see here that the large group of non-cyclists, many of them hail from an environment, social environment, that does not foster cycling. And they come from families and peer groups that cycle very little or not at all. Okay. The impact of life events, just briefly, there you can see there are some interesting issues around you know, residential relocation, changing job, but also illness and disability and retirement. And in some cases, and this is the important part, this led to less cycling. And in fewer cases, on the right-hand side, you can see that moving hometown or changing job or retiring actually led to more cycling. So the jury is still out. In terms of numbers, you can see a lot of the life events on the left-hand side led to less cycling, but you find the same events also on the right-hand side, in some cases leading to more cycling. But at the bottom there, you have the number of people. So you can see that's a much smaller group. Yeah. And the impact of mobility milestones here, again, interesting. Access to a car, of course, often curbs cycling. Losing access to a bicycle does the same. Changes in infrastructure and public transport paths can all impact on cycling in a negative way. But at the same time, you can see on the right-hand side, changes in infrastructure can also lift people out of the sort of non-cycling state and maybe encourage cycling. And also, interestingly, we have a group that gained access to a car and used bicycles more then as well. So that's an interesting issue of multimodality that we haven't quite understood yet. Okay. So here's some key findings from the active project, just briefly, before I add my concluding remarks and we enter the discussion. So non-cyclists tend to have little or no experience of cycling culture. Their family, their peers, their friends, the wider social environment doesn't cycle, and cycling is not seen as a viable mobility option by many of them. And life events and mobility milestones may increase or decrease cycling, and this is not a window of opportunity for a sustainability transition per se, but it can be looked at as a potential disruption. So you can start thinking, is there an opportunity for policy here to make use of that? What we know from the literature as part of Rad Active, we know that experimentation can really be a promising tool to foster cycling. That's a very positive message we got from the qualitative interviews. So being able to try things out, being able to cycle the route to work in a relatively sheltered sort of way and to have a positive experience can really change people's perception of cycling and can sort of interrupt that sort of view of cycling as not very useful. It remains to be seen how the current pandemic contributes to that. We have pop-up bicycle lanes in Munich and Berlin and other places, so it remains to be seen whether this is the major experimentation zone, if you like, that encourages people to cycle more. And what we also know that there's really significant cross-national variations. You can look at some work done by Haustein et al. And there needs to be more research and learning as well from other places. So just some concluding remarks. We have mobility defined as a set of more or less resource-intensive daily practices, and they change across the life course. And you have these turning points that often link to incisive life events and mobility milestones, but also there's less noticeable and more gradual developments. So this constant exposure to an environment that's very distant from cycling and that doesn't see cycling as a viable option is a good example of that. So it doesn't necessarily have to be this sort of cutoff point or this incisive event. It can also be gradual shifts that contribute to the development of mobility biographies. And individual mobility biographies always reflect wider social, economic, and political conditions. And we can see a lot of opportunities in of research approach, especially this emphasis on viewing mobility as a very dynamic practice, and that shifts attention to both changes in the material world, if you like, material artifacts, and also changes in meanings and norms that also hold the current car-centric system in place. And this is obviously of high relevance to policymakers, especially those who are pushing for a sustainability transition in the transport and mobility field. We need to be able to understand what automobility is for, what people do, and how that gets them into the car. And only if we understand that more properly, and if we understand it in a sort of longitudinal sense across the life course, we can then start thinking about other transport modes and other offers that can achieve the same goals that people have to get through everyday life. So there's this intertwining of mobility and other practices that is absolutely essential. And the life course perspective can really help you understand that better, especially when you think about, for example, caring responsibilities for others. So this is just a concluding remark to perhaps rethink transport policy, much stronger focus on the dynamics of mobility across the life course. And just some literature here for your perusal. And I'm very happy to take questions now and answer them. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Henrike. Round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you for that very interesting talk. It was very rich, both conceptually and in terms of the empirical material that you brought in. I would very much like to open the floor now to questions from our students. So you can either ask your questions in the conversation mode or just turn on your microphone. I might ask the first one while people are getting ready and sort of abuse of my role as the chair. Uh,
Go ahead, Marlene.
So you've been working, quite a bit on this idea of how life events and mobility milestones have to be understood, and how to, as you just said, understand what is mobility for across the life course. But you've also been doing some interesting, let's say, transdisciplinary work, or you've been engaging with non-academic partners, let's say, in these discussions. How would you represent the way that let's say, engineers or urban planners, or other people interested in mobility at the level of cities, how do they react to these approaches? Have they integrated this notion of diversity across the life course, or is it really hard to get this message through?
Yeah, thanks, Marlene, for this question. It's a very pertinent and important one. I must say that it's a sort of mixed message that I can bring. On the one hand, obviously, you have people especially in the mobility biographies research field, who come from the engineering side of the house and who are incredibly open to finding new ways to understand why people move. Partly because they've seen the limitations of current policy and current approaches. This said, on a practical level, it's very difficult to convince people, for example, planners, that you need to perhaps think about different groups in society and their transport needs and their infrastructural needs, and that this may also lead to sort of new ways of planning cities, for example, and planning new neighborhoods. And this is very, very hard because institutions are there, they have their own logic, legislation is there, and it's hard to shift. So we've seen some gradual shifts away from sort of this one size fits all. There's some interesting literature on child-centered planning, urban planning, but it's still a long way to go, I think, before we will see kind of, for example, child-friendly cities all the way. I mean, that's we're still quite far away from that, but I think it's worth keeping an eye on that. And I certainly talk to anybody who listens about these issues, and sometimes you see people with an open ear there on the planning level there, very much so.
I actually asked my question without reading one of the questions that came up in the chat from Francisca Matei, who was also asking about this interface between science and policymaking. Now, perhaps specific to policymaking, is that another challenge, another hurdle in and of itself?
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is, of course, I just briefly mentioned it. Our two current projects, Radaktiv, that I introduced today, and also another project, Zira, which is about cycling safety. They're both funded by the Federal Department of Transport. And there is an understanding there that cycling needs to be better understood, and that the promotion of cycling is something that should be part and parcel of current and future transport policy in Germany. But again, I think there are gaps in understanding. There's often an incredibly strong focus on cities, of course, because cycling is gaining momentum in cities, but we need to think about rural areas as well, and the possibility of promoting cycling there is a very different one. But I think there's a good foundation there already to build on, but more needs to be done. But we're very happy that we have regular interactions, for example, with the federal department, and there are plans of it to invest quite heavily in cycling infrastructure. So obviously we would say, well, that's not enough. We maybe need to think about promoting cycling as part of the school curriculum. That'd be a very useful investment.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned that bicycle lanes are popping up due to COVID, and we're seeing the same thing here in Geneva, actually, not without some, let's say, resistance from
of course,
car owners. Another question has come up from Anna Deveza. So you have students here that are thanking you in the chat for your talk. She's really interested in digital nomad lifestyles. Have you looked at these lifestyles at all? Have you seen any perhaps research underway that's looking at studying their mobility biographies?
Yeah, there is some work. I'm thinking about Friedberg's work, and obviously John Urry was very interested in digital nomads as well. I think it's an interesting group, but on the other hand, it's a very small group. You know, still, I think it's quite important to not ignore the majority of people who have just sort of reluctantly engaged in I suppose teleworking, if you like, or home office as we call it here. And you know, we must not forget the 40% or so of people, for example, in the Munich context, who continue to travel every day to work and back from work during the pandemic, because they have jobs that are just, they can't be done online and digitally. So I think it's important to understand digital nomads and their lifestyles, but there's also other groups that are very relevant and important from a research perspective. Yeah.
Thank you. Anna Regli, you have a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
So I know that we talk a lot about, you know, like so how urgent it is to move to a better, like to better mobility systems. But I wanted to ask you, how does personal comfort plays into this urgency? Because like, I know that I'm from Geneva, so I've lived all my life having a bicycle. So for me, it's really easy to switch from not using the car to using a bicycle. But I'm really trying to think how, if someone has never biked before, or if it's something that doesn't, you know, come naturally, how do you tackle personal comfort, which is something that's really a bit, I don't know, untouchable
Yeah.
kind of?
Yeah, this is a very important and relevant question. There's, I suppose, at least two levels to that. The bigger picture is how do we change norms in society that portray certain transport modes in certain ways? You know, the car is comfortable, the bicycle is not. The public transport system is dangerous, which is something we hear now a lot. You know, so you know, this is the first level. So the societal expectations and norms. And then you have the individual level where I think, for example, experimentation can really contribute to a change in perception. You know, so once you get people to try a few months, at least, you know, try and get to work by bicycle, and they discover that A, it's feasible, B, it doesn't rain as much as they think, C, they can carry everything they need to carry, and also they have this exercise moment when they kind of go, okay, I actually feel much better. Then you know, you can start to see them sort of adopt this more permanently. But you know, we have to be careful not to overstate shifts in mobility practice that are currently observable. We don't know whether these will last. I mean, a lot of people have sort of, you know, they've run for cover into their cars in the Munich context, and we can see that a lot. People are afraid of public transport, unfortunately, and now they've moved back into their own cars. And the car manufacturers in Germany are delighted with the rise in car sales. So that's something we have to consider as well. So absolutely, comfort is a big issue. Yeah.
And I think comfort relates also to security, which is not only about social norms, but about actual infrastructure. It's one thing to have secured bike lanes in which you can take your children. I mean, there's something about, I think, the material arrangements of mobility that are quite, you know, that really can lock in certain forms of
Absolutely, absolutely, Marlene. And we can see that when you look at moving traffic, that's one aspect, but it's also the whole issue of parking, and not just, obviously, cars are parked most of the time, but cycling infrastructure is not just about cycling lanes, it's also how you can lock your bike somewhere safely, especially if you have a cargo bike that is worth 4,000 or 5,000 euros. And this is increasingly an issue that people raise, you know. And again, it comes back to how we distribute public space as well in densely populated areas. Who has the right to use 12 square meters to park something? You know, is it the car driver? Is it the cyclist? How do we want to manage that as a society? I think that's a very pertinent question.
Any other questions from the students? Let's see.
I see a question on topography.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, Emily, is that, yeah. Yeah, just maybe briefly, I get this question quite a lot, but it's quite interesting to see that some of the cities that are very pro-cycling and have a very large share of cyclists in their modal mix, they may not have the most conducive to the cycling topography, and they have hard winters and so on. So it's often more than topography or weather, but obviously if you have a very hilly city, I'm thinking in Ireland, Cork, for example, is extremely hilly. It'd be very hard to get people to take up cycling there because the perception is there that it's hard. But e-bikes are an interesting angle to this. We see that a lot in the Alps now for leisure travel, that people now basically use their e-bikes to get up mountains. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know, but it's happening. So yeah.
Yes, there was another question then about Netherlands and the landscape. It's true, but I guess it's not the only reason from what we're hearing. I really liked the quantitative data that you shared. I think there's so many interesting sort of inroads to explore there, and this idea of social relations coming out so prominently, that people who are, I guess, who either grew up in families where they biked, and can you see sort of can you look at the data in a certain way to understand whether that relates to transitions of using bikes for leisure, let's say in a family outing type of situation, to using bikes for work? Does the data show any kind of spillover effect between leisure and work?
Yeah, I mean, when you grow up in a family that uses bikes for leisure travel, you're not as, in inverted commas, disadvantaged in terms of considering cycling as an option compared to those who have no experience, where parents also don't cycle at all. And so that's definitely, the leisure travel element is an entry point for some. But I think there's still, it's quite sticky in a sense that people who use the bicycle for leisure travel, they don't see it as a serious sort of commuting tool. And this is something that one could get over by, for example, encouraging them to try it out, or maybe encouraging them from a policy side as well to travel to work by bike, because they obviously they have the skills. You see, they can cycle when they travel in their spare time and they use the bike. They can cycle. The cycling skills and competences are there, and that's a major bonus. A lot of we see a growing number of children in Germany now who can't cycle, and there's a sort of cycling test in primary school towards the end of primary school, and a growing number of kids fail that test. They can't cycle, and they're not taught how to cycle. So again, that brings me back to my plea for more education around mobility in schools and in other outlets.
Yeah. And the skills and competencies for fixing your bike also, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. A question from Ilka Vega. So what about using Facebook or other sort of forms of social media to promote cycling culture? Does that seem to work?
Yeah. That can work very well. We work very closely on an ongoing basis with the ADFC. This is the German Bicycle Club, and they, for example, they run cycling training for people who feel that they may not be best equipped to cycle in densely populated urban areas with a lot of traffic. They offer courses for people who recently arrived in Germany from other parts of the world who have poor cycling skills or where their own culture doesn't promote cycling. Yes, there's definitely opportunities, and they go through social media quite a bit. Our current project Zero, we use social media quite a lot, Twitter and Facebook, and we recruited people really quickly for our empirical part. We were looking for people who cycle a particular part of Munich and then report back on sort of safety issues. The only problem with that is, of course, you only get very dedicated cyclists. And so, it's important to get out of that bubble, if you like, and to reach people as well who may not be as confident, for example, to cycle.
Yeah. Sarah's asking, can you give some examples of those non-flat cities that are using bikes quite a bit?
Well, I suppose it depends on how you define non-flat. I mean, there are certainly cities that have elements that are quite steep, but I'm quite surprised how some cities have very tough winters with a lot of snow. Copenhagen can get an incredible amount of snow occasionally during the winter, where you've ice, snow, sleet, the whole works, and you do get people to cycle. So for me, that's a real comfort issue. You know, you have to wrap yourself up in the morning and cycle in and out. So I think I always use that as an example of how you can overcome seemingly natural barriers to cycling. But you're absolutely right. I think flat cities fare better. That's a fact. Yeah. But have you examples maybe? I would love to learn more about cities. Maybe one of you is from a place that's quite hilly and has a good track record.
Well, I mean, I know that as you were saying, the e-bikes are really a way of circumventing this issue. So even in cities like Lausanne, you know, people are now, which is a hilly city, people are now using more e-bikes. Yes, so that was the example that.
I mean, this is interesting. The e-bike can serve a number of functions, but one is obviously to overcome topography issues. The second one is to overcome range issues, and this is obviously something, you know, a lot of people in Munich live in Munich's commuter belt, and it's a very vast commuter belt. I mean, Munich is the most it has the biggest commuter belt in the whole of Germany. So what you see now is that people travel distances by bicycle were traditionally reserved to car-based commuting. So that's an interesting development. So it's not just getting over hills, getting across long distances. That's an interesting trend to observe. There was a question on rebound effects there in the chat. To give some examples, well, I suppose on a global scale, you just need to think about the motorization, if you like, of parts of Asia, where partly with the aid of Western car manufacturers, the car was pushed as an alternative to traditional modes of transport, cycling, you know, motorbikes, mopeds, scooters, etc. But in terms of rebound effects as well, I mean, engine efficiency has increased, no doubt, in many Western countries. But the problem is a lot of people moved further out because you could travel faster and you paid less. So you made it up by moving further out. So we have seen a very big increase in commuting distances over the 20th century. So yeah, these are the kinds of rebound effects you get. I hope I answered that question.
Yeah.
Okay, Bern is hilly and has a lot of cyclists. Thank you. That's good to know.
The next one's about education, or what other opportunities there could be for adult education. Yeah. I know there was a project in Switzerland called Bike to Work. It may be even a popular campaign elsewhere, where people hand in the keys to their car and take a bicycle, but they do it as a community of practice. So it happens either at the workplace or the gym. I don't know if you have other examples.
Well, we're currently working with a small group of very dedicated teachers and sort of headmasters and headmistresses of different schools in Bavaria, and they've formed a network called School Bikers, and they're really adamant to establish cycling as part of the PE curriculum. So physical education on bikes, but to also integrate the bicycle much more into other subjects areas like geography. You know, you can do excursions by bike, etc. So they're really, really focused on promoting cycling as a sport, an active sort of sports activity in schools, and to promote cycling perhaps as well as an alternative to other leisure pursuits that are increasingly difficult to pay for. I mean, skiing is a big issue here in Bavaria, and a lot of children learn in school how to ski. Even kindergartens offer skiing courses for kids, but obviously this is an increasingly expensive hobby to have, and the issue of having warmer winters and less snow is also rearing its ugly head. So maybe this is an alternative to more traditional sort of school education, physical education courses as well, or at least a complementary one.
Yeah, absolutely. And then they could teach them how to bike in snow.
Exactly. Mountain biking is a big thing, and I mean, this is very popular in Bavaria as well. So I think it'd be well worth looking into that. Yeah. Absolutely.
There's another question here.
Oh yeah, the individualization of the life course. Are you there already? Sorry.
Yeah, that one.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, it's interesting to take the example of a car purchase after you have your first child. We have lots and lots of evidence in a German context now that a lot of young couples who used to cycle or walk or use public transport purchase their first car when their first child is born. So there's a connection between having your first kid and having a car. And this is not something that happens individually. This is something that you can see as a social phenomenon, because a lot of norms around how to transport a baby are linked to using cars as seemingly safe modes of transport, as a seemingly safe mode of transport. So the idea that everybody does their own thing, and that the life course is increasingly a sort of an individual project. You have to look at that in more detail, and you can see that there are still large parts of the population doing the same thing at around the same time in the life courses. And I think this is an important insight you get from the mobility biographies literature. Yeah, so it sort of runs parallel. This strand of research has run parallel to sociological work on the life course. So I think there are some interesting tensions between these two sort of bodies of literature, I think.
I would
Thank you.
another question,
Yeah.
but I'm turning on the microphone now, if that's fine. Thanks for the talk. I'm coming back again, I think, more to the policymaker side. So I'm also from Germany, and I have the feeling that in the discourse on urban planning and transport infrastructure planning, it's a lot about, for instance, in my area around Hamburg, it's a lot about how do we change roads, how do we change our subway system, etc. But the discourse is less on how do we, for instance, decide on investments on so-called bike autobahns throughout the whole city in order to ensure a safe infrastructure. Because I have the feeling from conversations that I had with colleagues at work, they don't take the bike because they don't feel safe, because it's often that we have the lines on the streets and it's just not convenient. And if you look at examples like Copenhagen or even Helsinki, who have a very nice and interesting road system for bikes, I'm wondering what are the major roadblocks probably in the German situation in terms of policy making when we think of how to develop these infrastructures. It would be interesting. What's your point of view on that, since you're more in depth?
There's a few barriers that need to be tackled. Well, first of all, I think I mentioned earlier, you have to think about moving traffic as well as parking traffic. This is really important, and there's often a real disparity between the two. Secondly, there is increasing competition between different road users in cities in particular, and there's often a reluctance on the policy side to deal with that. You have to ex-novate sometimes to be able to innovate, meaning you have to maybe get rid of some of the things. This is obviously something that is very hotly debated. Every car parking space that is removed in Munich currently during the pandemic, there's efforts to give smaller cafes and restaurants a leg up by basically freeing up some car parking spaces outside their premises so they can put extra tables there. This was so contested and hotly debated in Munich. So there is a real sort of reluctance to tackle that, but it has to be done, because you often have a situation where a lot of different users are competing for a public space, and so that's a really big issue that needs to be looked at. I think what is also missing often is a focus on vulnerable groups and groups that are more exposed to risks, be it children, older people, people who are visually impaired, you name it. And it's, I think that is something that is not really there yet. I know there's legislation, I know there's good intentions, but in practice, it's still a work in progress. And a final point perhaps as well, the system can be incredibly resistant to change and very resilient in some respects. We continue to build bicycle infrastructure, for example, that is too narrow for cargo bikes. You can't cycle on a lot of these things because it's too narrow. So because we have basically rules and guidelines in place that are for conventional bikes, so there's a lag, a time lag there as well in terms of innovation moving ahead in certain sectors. and then you don't have the guidelines to match. So, I mean, one point I wanted to make as well is I recently spoke to some colleagues from Berlin, and there's obviously a lot of emphasis on cycling and pop-up bicycle lanes and so on. But even there, you have a very strong emphasis on infrastructure, as if this is the only solution. You know, there's other things that need to be looked at, changing perceptions, changing perceptions of cycling risks as well. You know, we know that a lot of people perceive certain aspects of the infrastructure system to be dangerous, and they're not the most dangerous parts. And it's often other parts where we're finding that now with our current project. It's other parts that are far more dangerous, but they don't see it that way. So this is something to consider. And then in the end, I suppose mobility, socialization, and education is crucial. There's a growing number of younger people who don't do their driving license anymore, or they postpone it until late in their 20s. So there's a lot of people who just don't have no experience of, you know, sort of rules of the road, how to turn in a junction area and so on. And we have to cater for these people as well. I think it's crucial to avoid risks and accidents, etc. And the accident statistics, you know, in many countries in Europe, you know, there's a lot of room for maneuver there. I mean, and you have zero tolerance countries, and they fare very well because they educate people. And I think that's a crucial aspect as well.
There's some questions that popped up. I'm going to skip to Israel or Yakawa's and maybe come back to the other one about
yes.
because you're talking about, you know, systems and how they can be really resistant to change. We just had Julia Steinberger here in Geneva.
Oh, great.
To talk about her new article that came out with Giulio Mattori and some others on the political economy of the car industry. And it was really fascinating to see at what point, to what extent the car industry really sort of has a hold on political, economic dimensions. And so this question, I think, very much relates to that. Is resistance in Germany due to the strength of the automobile industry? And can we really talk about promoting bike culture without tackling the beast of car culture?
Yeah, thanks, Marlene, for raising that. I'm a colleague of mine, Michael Mögel, and I published a paper recently, and the title is Cultivating the Car State, and it's about mobility cultures in southern Germany, and it relates very much to some of the work done by Mattioli and others. Yes, of course, there's a great level of resistance there, but it's not just because car manufacturers don't want a change. It's also because there's obviously a very strong pro-car culture in many parts that is supported by the population, you know, and especially in car manufacturing regions, people's lives and life courses have been intertwined with the lives of car manufacturing industries. You know, in Stuttgart you worked for Daimler, and this was a great sort of source of pride in the past. And so, and it's not just obviously the main manufacturers; it's also those who deliver parts. You can see it's an extensive network with a lot of jobs attached. So it's totally important to look at not just the consumption of distance, but also the production of distance and of mobility tools. Absolutely. So we can learn a lot from that. And so I think a more holistic approach is needed there to offer alternatives as well. I mean, of course, you know, the electric car has way fewer parts, and it's potentially much cheaper to produce. And a lot of you know, the people in the second tier that deliver parts and produce parts for cars that have a combustion engine, they will need to look for other options. You know, if you go for e-mobility. So I think it's a very pressing matter. Absolutely.
Yeah, that was the last question there on whether, you know, e-bikes are an issue because of price, and is there, so can something more be done around sharing? Have you studied sharing of e-bikes or bikes? And
yeah, I mean, this is an interesting outcome of the pandemic here in Germany, at least, because a lot of public transport providers in larger cities are basically mobility services providers, not just public transport, but also bike sharing, carpool, and so on. We can see some interesting initiatives there to increase opportunities for multimodality, so people can cycle one part and then use public transport for the remaining part. So yes, there are opportunities, and I think the e-bike sharing network could be extended. Of course, it's not, it's only one part of the solution. I'm intrigued. I have just around the corner from my place there is a bicycle shop, and it only sells cargo bikes. And a lot of them obviously are now e-cargo bikes. So I go in there and marvel at the price tags sometimes, and I go, who are the people who buy these? I mean, you can get really sophisticated ones now that cost 6, 7, 8,000 euros, and they have to be regularly maintained, just like a car. So it's an interesting development as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We also have something similar here in Switzerland. It's a multi-modal mobility card that allows us to have access to trains, bikes, bike parking, and car sharing. So yeah,
absolutely. So apps can work wonders there. I must say, I mean, it's to integrate that into one app, say provided by the public transport provider, is a very useful step, I think, and bike sharing could be part of that.
I was going to maybe take one more question or two and then conclude. So there was a question here from Valentina about, so if car buying is associated to people having their first child, what could be done at that moment? So could you have sort of a life stage or life event approach to sustainable mobility?
Yeah, there have been some interesting small-scale initiatives. For example, Heidelberg, and what they've tried is they've tried to encourage young parents to consider alternative options. For example, you can get some really nice sort of cargo bikes, also carriers and trailers, where you can easily put a small child into that trailer and do it so in a safe way. So they've run experiments and they've offered people sort of test days where they could try it out. And interestingly, they used midwives as sort of intermediaries, if you like. So they were trying to get to parents before the child is actually born to basically discourage them from buying a car and encourage them to use bicycles as a safe mode of transport for small kids. But it's there's a lot of interesting perceptions around what's the best way to carry a baby, and a lot of people would see a bicycle trailer as an unsafe sort of place, and that's hard to tackle.
Yeah, unsafe, but also I remember doing some interviews with people where mobility was part of the interviews, and this idea that you're inhaling the fumes. So it's
absolutely
to be on your bike in the countryside. It's another thing to be behind.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So true.
Yeah. Great. So I think that was one of the last questions. Does anyone else have one more question? We have about 2 more minutes. And if not, I want to thank you so much, Henrike, for this wonderful talk. I feel that students now who are interested in pursuing mobility as a theme, maybe for their term paper or for their master's thesis, really have a lot of inroads here with the presentation that you made. Would you be comfortable with us sharing the slides in PDF format?
Yeah, that should be okay, as long as it's done internally. I think that is fine. I'm happy to send you the slides. Absolutely.
Yes,
yeah.
Students, or just the list of references at the end would be good, perhaps, for them.
Absolutely. Yeah, no problem at all. I'll do that after the talk. No problem.
Well, thank you so much.
Thanks for
everyone.
Thank you.
Taking off their mutes to give a round of applause.
That'd be great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll now stop the recording.